I'm working on a game that takes place in a huge procedural city that can be fully explored, and I got to the stage where I'm adding core gameplay elements layer by layer. I've decided that my city won't have fast travel, so traversal will be an important part of the gameplay, which means I need to add ways for the player to find points of interest and actually get to them. As I mentioned in my other videos, I already have transport such as self-driving taxis and high-speed trams, but until recently there was no way to orient yourself in the city or figure out where to go and how to get there. So these past few weeks I've been working on a system of addresses that can be generated for every single location in the city and intuitively discovered by the player. On the other hand, I don't want to make finding the right place too easy by displaying quest markers in the game world or on a compass. Instead, I'd like to keep these navigation UIs diegetic, like these map terminals, so the player actually has to pay attention to their environment. Now, creating addresses for a city that's already built sounds simple, but in reality was quite challenging. As I mentioned in my other videos, the core characteristic of my procedural city is its size, and the fact that it loads in parts of varying detail, increasing towards the player's position, which means that the game effectively has no idea what's happening outside of the area the player is currently in. But of course I want to generate addresses and maps for any location anywhere in the city, not just the ones that are currently loaded. In order to do that, I first had to do some refactoring to separate the data from the rendered objects, so I can use information about a certain object without having to spawn it in the game world. Would have been so much easier if I started coding my project that way from the get-go, but back then I didn't think it would get this complex, so here we are. So the city is structured as a series of nested objects. There's one parent, the city, which then gets subdivided into sectors, which in turn are subdivided into districts, then blocks, then the buildings. But the key mechanic is the same. A parent object spawns its children and determines their characteristics. So to find a specific building, I first need to initialize the sector it's in, then the district, then the block, and those objects have a lot of parameters and attributes. So I had to separate the essential topology data from the non-essential parameters into a global controller that can generate only that essential information about a certain city subdivision on demand. This enabled me to access the coordinates and the dimensions of each of city's spaces and do it without actually spawning the parent objects. And of course, each object that actually spawns in the game world now also requests that data from the global topology controller rather than generate it on its own, so it remains consistent. This change allows me to access the information about any building or floor anywhere in the city, as long as I know either its coordinates in the game world or the hierarchy of objects it belongs to. This information is enough to generate the map of the area. Although right now the map only shows sectors and skytram lines, I can theoretically zoom in all the way to individual buildings. Just need to add the UI for it. But this is still not quite enough to generate realistic addresses. In real cities, buildings are usually arranged by streets, while in mine they are arranged by blocks. Of course, I could just make it simple for myself and generate addresses based on blocks rather than streets, but I think it would be more practical to follow the convention and use streets for address identification. From the player's perspective, it's also much easier to find a building by following a street where buildings are numbered in a succession, and different sides of the street have either even or odd building numbers. So this is what I went with. Now the challenge is, the streets in my city are generated separately from other objects and are not part of the hierarchy I mentioned before. The way they work is I generate the blocks first, and then I find the segments between them and make sure they don't overlap. These are my streets. So there's a problem. In order to number the buildings along a street, I need to know how many buildings there are in total along that street and where all of them are located. So in order to give an address to one building, I have to load a whole lot of other buildings, which can be quite slow as some of my streets are quite long. The only solution I came up with for now is to give each building an approximate number based on a kind of a grid. The grid size is equivalent to the size of the smallest building that can spawn. That way I won't have two buildings with the same number. Although the downside is some numbers might be skipped. So the number of each building is determined by first its position along the street and then its distance from the street. And of course I need to make sure that one side only gets even numbers and the other only odd ones. It's not perfect, but it is the way to fulfill the essential conditions for an address. 1 being unique for each building, 2 increasing in the street's direction, and 3 indicating which side of the street the building is at. The downside of this approach, as I mentioned, is that the numbers aren't sequential, meaning some numbers will inevitably be skipped. That's also why some long streets will get very large building numbers. And I also have to mention the street names. Internally, my objects are identified by numeric IDs, which also serve as a seed for the random generator. And since I need some kind of readable names for everything in the city, I made a little text generator that creates names for pretty much everything from a numeric ID. It does so by generating individual syllables first, and then combining them into a word. The letters in the syllables are actually based on probabilities of the letters in the English language. That way the generated results are mostly readable, of course not always. Another approach would be to have a list of real words to name my streets after, but there are just too many of them, so that probably wouldn't work without repetitions. Or I could increase the probabilities of the more readable syllables and words to make sure the result is always readable, but it would also significantly reduce the variety and risk repetitions. So I have to strike some kind of balance there and take a chance at having a questionable but unique street name. So, now that I have addresses, I have a very basic gameplay loop that I can build on top of, which is to find an address of a point of interest, find out where to go and how to get there, get going, possibly encountering other points of interest along the way, find a unique quest or reward once you're there, and get the address for the next quest location. There's still a long way to go before my vision for the game is complete, but as always, I'll keep you guys posted. Stay creative!